Okay, lovely stuff. So this afternoon, at very short notice, the lovely Rob has stepped in to fill somebody else's shoes. And he sent over his stuff yesterday, and I took a look at it. And we went, "Oh my God, he's perfect for this." So let me introduce you, please, to the perfect Rob. Here he is.
But I like being called perfect.
So if you want to go ahead and share your slides from there.
Sure. I'll just get going, and I'll see here. That's my PowerPoint, and I'll share that. And once it comes up and says it's shared, which it is, then I'll go in and I'll play from the start of my slides. So hopefully you're all seeing a copy of my book, the most important thing, obviously.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Certainly are now.
So that's just. So I wrote that book a while ago, and one of the chapters in it is in fact very relevant to our talk today, and I'm gonna kind of go over some historical things there and some things about the future that I kind of group under the heading Women Own AI. I think that there's a lot of unknown history around women in computing and a lot of prospects for the future that are very interesting, and that's what I'm going to try to focus on today. So I hope I give you something that will be stimulating. So where I start off this talk is looking at women in computing up till 1987. And why am I looking at 1987? Well, a couple of reasons. One which I'll reveal later, but it's kind of the year I got started in AI. Probably about the time I started working in AI as a graduate student was around the late 80s, 85 to 87. So, and I happen to have these figures, which I think you'll find interesting. So you got to remember back in the 80s, it was a much different time, and women's participation in higher education was very different. So this is percentage of women versus men in university degrees of various kinds. And this is all US figures, but it's pretty consistent with the Western world. So if we look at education, unsurprisingly, from the 70s, when women first started participating in university a lot more than they were, there was a huge rise in women, and to the point where women became the majority of people taking education degrees. If we look at arts and performance, that starts pretty high and stays pretty flat into the 80s. Communication and journalism saw a dramatic rise from a minority, a large minority, up to a small majority. Social science and history, surprisingly, not at parity, but not changing that much. Biology rising, and in fact, that's very similar to the fact that women, as participation in university grew across the Western world, they also took on roles as doctors a great deal, particularly in Western countries. Physical sciences saw a climb, but look at that number; it's only like 25%. It's not very good. Lawyers, interestingly, and one of the things I used to teach at the University of Alabama, and we had a great emphasis on trying to have minority groups participate in engineering programs. And one of the things when we surveyed to try to up that percentage, we found out that kind of across the globe, when any minority group becomes better represented at universities, doctors and lawyers are one of the major gain areas. And that's because of social respect associated with those fields. So strangely, engineering, some rise there, but it gets up to about 12% there by the 80s. This is women in engineering really, really low, which we tried to work on really hard in Alabama when I was there. But here's the strange one. There's one field that is an engineering field at many universities that is different from the rest, and that is computer science. Computer science, if you look at this from the 70s to the late 80s, saw really what is a quite meteoric rise in participation of women in getting degrees, up to the mid 30s, heading towards 40 pretty rapidly. And if you look at the slope of that curve, that's actually growing faster than any university field surveyed. So effectively, computer science, greatest growth field. Now you got to remember what was going on in the 80s. Like when I learned computer programming, it looked like this. I actually am I'm the last year of people who learned to program on these things called punch cards, which some of you may have never seen, but it used to be you wrote computer code one line at a time, and one line was represented by a card where each of those little holes represents a letter in the alphabet, and that's your computer program. You very assiduously had to keep up with the cards being in the right order, because if you dropped your cards on the ground, your program was screwed up. That was where I started, but very quickly that changed. I mean, we had these machines that we punched the cards in, by the way, which this nerdy looking guy is kind of using one. That could have been me back in the 80s, but very quickly things moved over to being these CRT screens, and computers started looking a bit like this. And this is a 70s vintage photograph, but and you notice there are women there, which is very interesting. And the strange fact of history is that computing in the early days was a field really quite dominated by women, and you'll learn a little more about the history of that in this talk. But if we look back at those figures, so here were those figures again. Now these are stretched out. Now we're looking up to 2014, I think, is where this figure actually ends, and you kind of see what's going on with various fields. And if you look at computer science, remember up to 87, it looked like that, with this rapid growth that was really headed towards parity. The number was the same as lawyers, and headed up like crazy. You see where lawyers has gone, where doctors has gone. Still not at parity, but reaching up towards it. But unfortunately, this is what computer science has done. So since 1987, that's one of the reasons I picked this number. Since 1987, computing for participation for women has collapsed. And now it's back where engineering got to. Engineering climbed up to the end of the 80s and then sort of stagnated. It's at about 18%, as does computer science now. So it begs the question, what's gone wrong since 1987? And there are some theories, and I'm going to introduce some of those a bit later. But first, I'm going to flash back in time and say a little more about the idea that women have been major participants in computer science for a very long time. So, in fact, a long time ago, back in the early 1800s, the word computer was invented, and it wasn't a machine; it was a job description. Computers were people back in the late 18th and early 19th century. And one of the most important ones is this woman known as Mary Edwards, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. She was employed by the Board of Longitude to compute astronomical tables for the British Nautical Almanac for quite a long time there, from the late 18th century into the early 19th century. And this is a person I'm sure you've never heard of. If you have heard of her, you're a pretty rare person, because almost no one knows about her existence. However, she did something of massive importance, and to understand why, you have to kind of look at the globe and the way it turns. In the late 18th and early 19th century, the most important technology in the world, the kind of computers or jet planes of the world, were ships. Ships were the technology of importance economically and in every other way. Ships allowed nations to rule other nations, and they allowed commerce to flow from one place to another. And one of the most important problems in the world, their technological problems, had to do with locating where your ship was. Now, some things are easy. Locating where you are up and down on the globe, it's turned around this way. So locating it up and down is pretty easy, because you just look at the star that's above your head. And if you've got a star chart, then you can determine your latitude very easily. The problem is the globe's spinning around, so the stars move. So knowing what star's above your head doesn't tell you your longitude. So you can't, because the globe just keeps spinning, and you can't really know where you are from looking at the stars. Now, there was a method that was invented in London and was very important. Is the reason they made these nautical almanacs is because if you could look at the relationship between the moon, a relatively stationary body, relative to time, it only moves on a 30-day cycle, and look at it in relationship to stars, and kind of look at its distance from fixed stars to the moon, and do some computation, you could, with some accuracy, figure out where your longitude was, which is hugely important, because if you didn't know where your longitude was, what happened was your boat would land somewhere it shouldn't, and quite literally, you'd get all your goods stolen and possibly be killed. So it was a really important thing to know what longitude was. And longitude problem is solved eventually by technology, but for many, many years, the majority of navigation into the 20th century actually used this thing called the Nautical Almanac. And Mary Edwards was one of the main people around the Nautical Almanac. Now, let me tell you the story. Her husband was a pastor somewhere up in the north of England, Yorkshire, I believe. And like a lot of science guys, he was an experimenter with astronomy because, as I said, looking at stars was really important to technology. And one day he was putting a coating of mercury on a glass mirror and inhaled the mercury vapors and dropped dead. And leaving his wife of a pastor, and his daughter without much income. And they were doubly hurt because, first of all, his job as a pastor was gone. Second of all, the main way he was earning extra money was by doing computations. He was a computer, and he was one of the most important computers in the world because he was doing about half the calculations of the Nautical Almanac by himself. And those computations that went into ships figuring out where they were at sea were done by this one guy. So Mary was destitute, and so she comes to London and talks to the Neville. I forgot Neville's last name. The guy who's the head of the Greenwich Observatory, who controlled the Nautical Almanac, and said, "It wasn't my husband; it was me." And it turns out he wasn't doing the computations; she was doing them. Somehow, this uneducated, working class woman knew how to do computations and had been doing half the computations in the world in the most important document in the world. He gave her a contract. She continued doing this job throughout her lifetime and throughout the most important period of the use of the Nautical Almanac. She and eventually her daughter did half the computing that was the most important in the world. Now, how did she learn how to do this? Obviously, she really did do it because she continued doing it for I think 50, 60 years. How did she know how to do it? Well, we don't know. And the reason we don't know is this. We don't know her maiden name. Because women were, socially not important, particularly if you were working class, you basically, no one kept good records on you. And so no one knows who Mary Edwards actually was. Her maiden name is lost to history. So that begs the question of us understanding history of women in many ways. But that a contemporary of Mary Edwards did some pretty substantial change in that area, and that's this woman, Mary Wollstonecraft. He wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. That's very contemporaneous with the period where Mary Edwards was working. And the reason I bring her up is this was the first feminist book of literature written in the English language. It had very modest demands, like that girls should go to school, that girls other than upper class girls should go to school, and that the education provided to both boys and girls should be the same, that boys should be taught how to do things domestically around the house. It was a very modest book in many ways, but was radical at the time and eventually led to something I'll tell you about in just a minute. So Mary was a very interesting woman. She was from a middle class background, but her father was a wife beater and a gambler and lost all their family's money. So she had to work as a nanny for an aristocratic woman and decided she didn't like it. And at very great risk to herself, became an author and wrote various books. Just barely got by until she wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women, which gained her some fame, particularly in intellectual circles where she met William Godwin. Now, William Godwin, I won't go into because this talk isn't about the full history here, but he's one of the most important thinkers of the 18th century, influential on so many things that it's completely underestimated. But one of the books he wrote is his wife Mary Wollstonecraft died in childbirth, giving birth to their child. He was also named Mary. So he wrote this book about her life called Memoirs of the Author of Vindication of Rights of Women. And Vindication of Rights of Women was so scandalous in some ways that he didn't have to mention who it was about. But as an intellectual, he told a very truthful story of her life. And she had been very interesting. She had gone touring Europe during great European wars and had wild affairs and had a child out of wedlock with one man she had an affair with. And she then became William Godwin's mistress, and she got pregnant, and then they got married, and they had Mary, and she died. And he was very proud of her and told the honest story of her life, for which she was completely and utterly vilified and treated as a as sort of a illustration of why women shouldn't be intellectuals, shouldn't participate in life, because she was so wanton. And this was widely publicized. The book um, was really quite vilified after her death, because her husband did this nice thing of writing an honest story of her life. Now, she for about 70 years was a figure of vilification until she was taken up as a hero by the suffragettes. Those of you who don't know the suffragette story really should know it. It's the movement started in 1872, but women didn't get the right to vote in England until 1918. And then it was only women over 30. Men over 21 could vote. Women over 30 were allowed to vote after passing certain qualification tests, and in 1918. And then there was not equality of vote in England until 1928. So only about, what is that, 90 years ago, really, that women were given full suffrage in the UK. And Mary Wollstonecraft is a very important figure to the suffragette movement. So moving forward, why did I bring up Mary Wollstonecraft? It'll come back at the end. But this gentleman is Lord Byron, who everybody has heard of at least. Lord Byron, I bring into focus because compared to Mary Wollstonecraft, if Mary Wollstonecraft was a virginal saint compared to Lord Byron. Lord Byron, only 70 years later after Wollstonecraft's life, he had famous affairs around the world, abandoned his firstborn child, had an affair with his sister and had a child with his sister, had affairs with both men and women, went to the continent like Mary Wollstonecraft, and was kind of a bon vivant around wartime, and basically was, by all measures of the time, quite decadent. But Byron was held up. Byron is in fact the first influencer, the first celebrity is Byron. Byron, there was Byromania in England. He was so very popular despite all his various moral failings. So I bring that up as a bit of a contrast, and also there's something strange that comes out of that. So Byron abandoned the only legitimate child he ever had, and that child was this woman, Lord Byron's daughter, whose name is Ada Lovelace. Lady Lovelace, by marriage, gained that title, and she was a woman of great social import. She was married to somebody who was a rich guy, and married to a lord, and was the daughter of the most well-known man in England at the time, and that afforded her a lot of social good. But her mother was very worried about her turning into her father, and because of that, she only allowed her to be educated in mathematics and science, because she didn't want her to become poetic, because she thought that her poetic father might emerge in her. So instead, she became the author of the first computer program. And if you don't know that story already, that's the reason we have an Ada Lovelace Institute, and why she's a figure who her name is well recognized. But I think she's underappreciated even today, and I want to say a few things about that. The program for which she wrote, the machine for which she wrote the first program was this machine. This is part of the machine, which you can see, by the way, at the Science Museum in London. This is Charles Babbage's difference engine, which eventually led to the first general purpose computer, which was made out of gears of brass. That was the analytical engine, both of which were never actually completed, by the way. They were theoretical devices. But Ada Lovelace read the papers about the devices, and because she was a friend of Babbage's, who was very impressed with her, met her when she was 18, and was very impressed with her mathematical abilities. And then she ended up writing a famous paper that really described this machine thoroughly. In fact, the first paper that describes a computer thoroughly in the world, and invents the first program. That was when she was 28. Now, many people claim Babbage invented the computer and Ada Lovelace was the first programmer. I don't think that's quite the right story. I think the reality is that the idea of computing per se was really invented by Ada Lovelace. Babbage and other men in the field at the time thought of computers as calculating engines. engines for making numbers, books of numbers like the Nautical Almanac, really. That's what they thought of them as being. The first person who started thinking about computers doing something like AI was really Ada Lovelace, and she wrote this: the analytical engine might act upon other things besides number. The engine might compose elaborate scientific pieces of music or of any degree of complexity or extent. So she was thinking about computers doing much more interesting things, and was thinking about, can computers do the same things that humans do? So in many ways, I think the idea of AI really originates with Lovelace. But then, of course, you know, the person let me finish this before I move on to my next slide. I love this quote. Imagination discovery is the discovery faculty preeminently. Mathematical science shows what is. Imagination too shows what is. Hence, she is or should be especially cultivated by the truly scientific, those who wish to enter into the worlds around us. So, you know, she was making an explicitly feminist statement here about women's education, and she wrote so many lovely things, and her letters are really worth a read. There's a volume of all of them that you can get a hold of. But she died at 36, so didn't get to really see out her career very much, and of course was limited by limitations of society. Now, I say she's the first person who thought of AI, but the person we most associate with AI is Alan Turing, who wrote about it, and of course made the first electronic general purpose computer. Turing, a monumental figure who no one can take anything away from, and some of you will know, a figure who was not recognized, was basically chemically castrated for being a homosexual, and committed suicide because he was pursued by British justice, which outlawed homosexuality, even though he is probably one of the most important war heroes of World War II because he broke the Enigma code. Just recently, I think in the past 3 or 4 years, isn't it, we finally put Turing on the money. Turing's on the 50 now, isn't he? And that took years to do. And in fact, Turing, there was no apology for how Turing was treated until sometime in the last 20 years while I've been living in the UK. So nothing can be taken away from Turing. But what's interesting is while Turing and other men who worked at Bletchley Park in the war effort are very valued, there are many other women like Joan Clark who basically did a lot of the computing work in breaking codes and participated in all the projects at Bletchley Park, but they're just not known. They're not known about. It's interesting to think why women were so present in computing, and I'll make some comments about that at the very end. But there's tons of women who aren't known. This woman, Melba Roy, some of you may have seen Hidden Figures, the movie. This woman was the head of computers at NASA. And it's interesting that women of color were very present in computing as well into the 60s. The early efforts to put men into space would not have been possible without women of color, who did a great deal of the early hand computing and then became the first computer programmers at NASA when computers moved in. And then this one is one of my favorites. This is the famous and incredibly beautiful actress Hedy Lamarr, who's known very much as an actress. Very few people know, and there's a great documentary on this that I think everybody should see, that Hedy Lamarr invented frequency hopping. Now, some of you may not know what frequency hopping is. Effectively, when you're using Bluetooth on your phone, what's happening is it's talking to your phone, and your Bluetooth device are talking at various frequencies that change over time. It hops around frequencies. The reason it does this is both for security and to avoid interference. So it hops around the frequency band, so it doesn't stay in any one frequency at any given time. And lots of devices use frequency hopping now. It's a standard technique. It was invented by Hedy Lamarr because she knew that torpedoes that were radio controlled were being jammed by the Germans during the war. And she had fled Austria and effectively invented this technology in her spare time using fairly primitive techniques. But she had the first thoughts of this idea that were turned into a patent. And she held the patent on frequency hopping. The US government took it off of her for national security reasons. They could do that with patents. They still can do that with patents, actually. And it's very likely that they abused that patent. And then eventually it expired because it was held by the government. then the technology became a mainstream and very important communications and computing technology. And Hedy Lamarr never saw a cent of it and was never recognized in any way as a great inventor because people were much more interested in concentrating on the fact that she was really, really good looking. So there's a great story of women in computing. So why this then? If women have been so important in computing, why has this happened? Now, I have some theories, and I think some of them are true. 87, what happened in 87 is that's about the time that the internet really started. The internet really got going in the late 80s. I remember when there were no web browsers, and around that time is when we started getting web browsers. Google didn't exist, of course, until maybe 5 or 6 years later. So the internet came in, and then I think that the idea of computing changed. I think computing went from a backroom activity to a front of house activity, and people became very famous for being great computer scientists. And I think at that point, the culture towards women had a dramatic change. This is a famous story from a few years ago. It used to be a few years ago that if you typed "are women" into Google, the autosuggest was evil. Evil was the autosuggest. And this is just an illustration of how big data analysis and the activities of human beings have basically made algorithms and AIs basically absorb some of our own prejudices. Along with that, there was this event called Gamergate that some of you may have heard of and some of you may have not. A lot of early computing was marketed to men because it was felt that only men were gamers, that only men would play computer games. And the early computers, personal computers, were very much marketed around gaming. Gamergate is when a lot of men from what we call manosphere communities like the Red Pill, PUA, which stands for Pickup Artist, and the incel community became paranoid that feminists were infecting the gamer community, and they started a campaign of really quite ugly harassment online that affected a great many feminists, and it spelled a really bad name for computing with women. By the way, I have to tell the story of the incel lonely cowboy. The lonely cowboy icon for the incels came out because someone wrote a piece saying that women like horses because they can use them to ride away and meet other guys. It's a really sad story. I just checked the time and I know I'm going slow, so I'm going to try to hurry up and finish. So basically, I think that what happened is computing became an ugly place for women to go in the 80s, but things have changed, and now there are a great many women who are taking prominent positions in computing and AI. One of them is my great friend and collaborator, Stephanie Forrest, who did incredibly important work in AI back in the 80s and 90s, which I could go on and on about, but I don't have the time. Then you've got this woman who's the director of MIT's CS and AI lab. Now, those are academic examples. But the penetration of women and their importance in AI goes far beyond the academic today. We've got the chief scientist at Google Cloud of AI is a woman. Timnit Gebru, I wish I had time to talk more about her, but she wrote a very, very important paper about AI's implicit bias that when she was at Google as a part of their ethical AI team. There's a very controversial story that she was pushed out because it criticized technology that Google was actually using, but that's controversial, but it is a very important paper. Carol Riley, the spin out from Stanford, self-driving car spin out Drive.ai, she's the co-founder of that. Allie Miller is the head of AI business development at Amazon. Kate Crawford founded AI Now, which is an organization that's really worth looking at, an ethical AI organization. There's a lot of presence in the ethical AI community of women today, including my friend Ruman Chowdhury, who has recently become the director of ethical machine learning at Twitter. So, this is now a community. There's a real community of women in AI, and I think a lot of those things that happened in the 80s are going away. Let's hope that those role models help bring young women into computing. It's a field. The last factoid I'm going to offer you is this: is that if you look at pay rates, women in their career progression get punished for having children. They lose income advancement for having children in the sad world we live in. One of the areas where that loss is least and sometimes doesn't exist at all is actually in computing. And that's because computing has always been really compatible to remote working. And so that's one of the theories. So effectively, computing is a really friendly environment for women who want to have a family and have a career too, and not be penalized for wanting to have a family. So I just want to throw that fact in. So finally, the reason I brought up Byron, besides it being a nice story about Mary Wollstonecraft, is that Mary Wollstonecraft, Will Godwin's daughter, was this woman, Mary Shelley, who in fact was the author of the first AI sci-fi novel, Frankenstein. So not only do women own AI, women own sci-fi as well. People forget sci-fi started with an 18-year-old girl writing a story about an artificially created human creature. So can anything be more female than effectively AI? And I really hope that some of you got something out of this, that maybe the history inspires you, and that some of you will consider a career in AI you may not have previously.